In the energy industry, many companies are considered private companies. So a publicly traded company is just that. It's publicly traded on a stock exchange. Private companies, on the flip side, they may have multiple owners, but those ownership shares are not traded on a public exchange. And don't think that all private companies are small. If you're a fan of M&Ms like I am, the company that makes them, Mars, is one of the most valuable privately held companies in the world. In the oil and gas business, a lot of the smaller independents are privately held as well. And what has happened over the past decade is many companies have started as private, grown, been successful, and at some point then been able to go public, much as Parsley did. So for these private companies, how do they finance their wells? Those of you that went with us on the lease visit met Mr. Matt Levasseur, the principal of Acadia Oil, which is a private company, and he told you how they fund their wells from their own checkbook. In other words, if they don't have it, they don't spend it. The beauty of this is you're never burdened down with debt resources, or with debt payments rather, but the downside is you're limited by your checkbook, and you may see lots of opportunities that you can't pursue. Then you can pursue the route of equity, bringing in other owners. Now, this can be on the company level, where you take an investment where they buy a chunk of your company, or what is very common in the E&P industry is that you invite people to participate on a well. Now, in this case, you're not actually changing any ownership of the company, but they're investing in that well for a set percentage of the working interest, and they get to share in the profits, just like an equity owner does. And I already told you that my wife and I have an investment with Mr. Levasseur and Acadia Oil, where we own part interest in a lease, which has several wells, but really only one well that produces. So very, very common in the independent E&P world for them to invest in each other's wells to try to reduce the risk of how much money you pump into a single well. And then many of the independents are also financed by debt, but it's a very specific type of debt called reserve-based lending, or RBLs. Very common in the industry, although right now under a great deal of pressure. And what this amounts to is a bank or some other entity, but mainly a bank, loans a company money based on the oil that is in the ground that's proven under other operating wells. And so they take as a borrowing base a set of proved reserves, and then they multiply that times a projected price, and they come up and they say, we think your reserves are worth, for example, $1 million. And they may then take that as essence collateral to issue a loan to a company. Typically, these loans are for 3 to 5 years, and they are never 100%. Banks try to be very conservative. The first is they will typically only loan something like, again, let's use that imaginative package of wells that's worth $1 million. They may only be willing to loan me between $500,000 and $750,000 based on those reserves. So they don't loan 100% of the reserves, although they have claims on their 100% of the reserves. And the other element is they price them very conservative. In D2L, there is a price deck of bank rates from 2017. I was not able to find a more recent price deck than that. And you can see there's a fairly broad range that banks were using to estimate the future values, but they're almost always lower than the current price. So they try to be conservative on the price. What I would have loved to have been able to find for you is a price deck from late 2019, because I can almost bet you none of them saw the price of oil going the direction that the price of oil went. With this reserve-based lending come a lot of covenants. For unproven borrowers, banks will often try to tie up their personal assets or personal guarantees. In other words, the company may not be able to repay it. If the company can't repay, then you personally have to repay. And as you would imagine, E&P executives resist those personal guarantees like the plague, because it can take out their personal net worth as well. Like I said, only unproven companies typically have to support to that. But then there are other covenants that are built in, like a ratio of cash flow, which would often be earnings minus the depreciation, to debt. So they want to make sure that you're throwing off enough cash to service the debt. And if you don't, then they can call the loan. And if they call the loan, in theory, they could take away, they could recall. If you can't repay it, your wells as collateral. And if you remember early in the semester, Mr. Carter talked about how they had done deals with banks to buy the debt to some loans. Right now, reserve-based lending is under a lot of pressure, and I'll talk about that more later. Within the spectrum of private companies, private equity has done a tremendous amount of investing in the E&P world, right? Just in general, private equity. So these are private investments made in companies. Typically, the players are institutional investors, some pension funds, or just high net worth individuals. And what typically happens is a private equity company who forms a lot of times a limited partnership, brings in a bunch of money from investors, and then it makes investments. And they expect to cash out in 5 to 7 years. In other words, this is not a long-term investment. They want to make the investment and they want to get their money back. And typically, the private equity company, the general partners, they get 2% of the invested fund annually and 20% of the profits. So it's a sweet deal, but private equity has been a major player in the E&P industry. So again, not always able to find the most current numbers, but in 2015, which was a bad year for private equity, the private equity industry invested about $39 billion worth of money into the oil and gas industry. EnCap is located down in Dallas, Texas. I had an opportunity to sit down and have a meeting with them once. They're one of about 40 private equity groups that focus on energy, probably one of the bigger ones, although there's some titanic ones like Blackstone that dwarf everybody else. They've raised 21 independent funds since their inception in 1988. They have put into play $37 billion worth of capital, and they've invested in 240 midstream and upstream companies. The midstream also is very capital intense, and so they sometimes play in that. That's what's happened. This is how it's traditionally happened, but obviously things may be a-changing. So in my final video, we're going to talk about how the world is changing in energy finance.